Hello everyone! Welcome to Literature Revision with Mr. Johnston. Today we're going to analyse Inspector Goole's final speech. This scene is widely regarded as the most important section of the play. Having interrogated every character, the inspector now presents the play's central message of responsibility. Now you may want to take notes during this video. If you do, try clicking the link in the description box below. There, you can download a section of my textbook on this extract. It comes complete with writing tables for taking notes, short writing tasks, and exemplar paragraphs. And now, on to the inspector's speech. Now, to understand the inspector's speech, we must first consider the purpose of Inspector Goole in this play. Perhaps the most useful way of thinking about Goole is to consider him as the voice of Priestley. It is through the inspector's character that the playwright offers his comments upon both the play's events and wider thematic issues. So it is nearly like Priestley has written himself into this play in the form of the inspector. The inspector very much provides a voice for Priestley's socialist beliefs throughout this play. But the clearest presentation of Priestley's views comes in the form of the inspector's speech, which we will now read. To give some context, the inspector has just finished interrogating Eric about his relationship with Eva Smith. And this is what the inspector says. "This girl killed herself and died a horrible death, but each of you helped to kill her. But just remember this. One Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night." So this video is going to explore 4 different ideas about this speech. Let's begin with number 1. Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to emphasize the theme of responsibility. So in many ways we can see an Inspector Calls as a typical detective narrative. It follows many of the tropes of this genre. For example, we have a tragic death. An inspector interrogates a number of suspects to see who is guilty. Dark secrets are revealed. But the play's final scenes seem to deviate from the conventions of this genre. Towards the end of the play, the inspector gives his final speech. He begins the speech by explaining how every member of the Birling family is guilty for Eva Smith's death. He says, "Each of you helped to kill her." So the inspector explains how every member of the Birling family is guilty. He goes through them one by one, explaining how they are each responsible for Eva Smith's death. Now, as you're going to see, this is a very unusual way to finish a detective narrative. So the structure of a typical detective narrative follows this pattern. At the beginning of a narrative, there are many suspects. There are many people who may have committed the crime. The detective arrives, he interrogates many different characters, and slowly but surely throughout the rest of the narrative, he whittles this list of potential suspects down until at the end of the narrative, he reveals the one guilty culprit. So at the beginning of a story, there are many potential suspects. At the end of a story, there is one individual who is named as guilty. But Priestley inverts this structure. Priestley turns this structure on its head. At the beginning of a play, the inspector arrives and unveils that Arthur is guilty. So he names a guilty character right at the start of the play. He explains that Arthur is responsible for Eva Smith's death. But the narrative doesn't end there. The narrative continues, and the inspector, by interrogating each character, names each character as guilty until by the end of the play, the inspector reveals that the whole Birling family is guilty. So, this has inverted the structure of the typical detective narrative. While a detective narrative tends to end by naming one guilty individual, the inspector calls ends by naming the whole Birling family as guilty. Why has Priestley chosen to invert the detective genre in this way? Well, such a structure really emphasizes the theme of responsibility. Priestley is demonstrating that every character is responsible for Eva Smith's death. Every character is guilty. Every character has blood upon their hands. Eva Smith's death cannot be blamed on a single individual. So this very much emphasizes the play's wider message. Everybody in society is responsible for other people. Priestley is reflecting the idea that for as long as the poor and vulnerable are suffering, every individual in society is guilty. We are all responsible for each other. So that brings us to the end of our first point. Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to reflect the theme of responsibility. Now we're going to test your memory on that idea. Look out particularly for the words in bold, as they are going to disappear in a few seconds. We'll read this one more time. Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to emphasize the theme of responsibility. Okay, try saying this sentence to yourself now by just using the first letters of the key words. You have 10 seconds. Okay, let's see how you have done. Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to emphasize the theme of responsibility. Well done if you got that right. Let's go on to idea number 2. Priestley uses Eva Smith to represent the poor and vulnerable who suffer because of capitalist society's cruelty. The inspector's speech very much changes the way that the audience views Eva Smith. The inspector states that there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. So these words seem to elevate Eva to a symbolic position in the audience's mind. Priestley doesn't want his audience to see Eva Smith merely as an individual. Instead, she is a representative of a broader cross-section of society. She represents the millions and millions of people who are in a very similar position. Now, who might these people be? Well, it's likely that Eva represents the poor and vulnerable working classes. She represents everyone who is dispossessed, impoverished, and struggling. In Priestley's view, Eva Smith is thus a representative of everyone who has been exploited by the dog-eat-dog world of capitalist society. Priestley uses Eva Smith to demonstrate his view that capitalist society is a cruel world where the poor and vulnerable are abused and exploited. In making the symbolic role of Eva Smith explicit to the audience, Priestley is encouraging us to consider the symbolic role of the other characters in this play. So if Eva Smith represents the poor and vulnerable working class, we might ask ourselves, what does the Birling family therefore represent? It's likely that the Birling family represents a capitalist class which exploits the poor and vulnerable. Perhaps Priestley is suggesting that the poor and vulnerable are abused by capitalist society in a similar way that the Birling family abuse Eva Smith. So this speech very much raises the play to the level of allegory. Now, in an allegorical story, every character tends to play a symbolic role. They are used to represent or symbolize something bigger than themselves. Now, an allegory also is a narrative that has a clear message. It is a story that is trying to convey a particular meaning. So we might ask ourselves, what is the message of this play? And that is something that we will look at when we get to point number 3. But before we move on, let's test your memory of these two ideas. We're going to read through both sentences and then get rid of the key words. Number 1. Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to emphasize the theme of responsibility. Idea number 2. Priestley uses Eva Smith to represent the poor and vulnerable, who suffer because of capitalist society's cruelty. Now let's test your memory. You have 20 seconds to read through both sentences, filling in the blanks of the key words. Okay, let's see how well we have done. Number 1, Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to emphasize the theme of responsibility. And number 2, Priestley uses Eva Smith to represent the poor and vulnerable who suffer because of capitalist society's irresponsibility. So well done if you've got all right. Let's go on to idea number 3. So this takes us to our third idea. Priestley uses the inspector's speech to advocate the establishment of a socialist society that takes responsibility for its members. So, as we have said, this is Priestley nearly stepping into the play as the inspector to present his socialist ideology to the audience. He might as well walk on stage here and talk to the audience himself. So let's see what Goole says. The inspector states that we don't live alone. Goole is suggesting here that the individual is not cut off from the rest of society. No man is an island. Everyone's life is interlinked. So Priestley might be using these words to critique Birling's view. You might remember during the engagement party, Birling gives his speech, and he says, a man has to make his own way. So this is a very individualistic perspective that Birling has. Birling believes that the individual is responsible for themselves and nobody else. He is implying that the individual can pursue their own selfish goals without consideration of other people. Goole has a very different perspective than Birling. Goole is stating that everyone's life is in fact interlinked with everybody else's. We all have responsibility towards each other. To convey this idea, the inspector uses a biblical metaphor. He describes society as one body. Now, to understand what the inspector is suggesting here, we must understand the context of these words. Goole is here quoting from the words of Paul the Apostle in his letter to the Corinthians. It is from 1 Corinthians 12, so this is a book from the New Testament. Priestley's 1945 audience would be far more biblically literate than a 21st century audience, and many of them would have recognized this reference. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul describes how the church should be united, and he says this: "For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, 'Because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body,' that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, 'Because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body,' that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But, as it is, God arranged the members of the body, each one of them, as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body." So St. Paul here is basically explaining that the church should be united because everyone is equal, and every person is interlinked in the same way that a human body is interlinked. Now, Priestley here is applying Paul's perspective not to the church, but to society. He is suggesting that everyone's life in society, no matter what sort of class they come from, is interlinked. We are like one big body. We must care for one another. So we've analysed Priestley's ideas that everyone in society is interlinked, and that society is one body, that we are all responsible for each other. Now, this takes us to the central message of the play. Priestley is advocating socialism as a superior ideology to capitalism. In other words, Priestley is demonstrating that a socialist society would be a better society than a capitalist society. How does he do this? Well, throughout the play, Priestley seems to be suggesting that capitalist society encourages people to act selfishly and ignore their responsibility towards others. And we can very much see this in the way that the Birling family abuse Eva Smith. In Priestley's view, in such a society, people like Eva Smith are exploited and abused. Priestley therefore seems to be advocating socialism as the perfect ideology for building a more responsible society. It is only in such a society, in Priestley's view, that the poor and vulnerable people, such as Eva Smith, would receive the care that they need. And that is the main message of this play. Priestley is advocating socialism as a superior ideology to capitalism. So we have now covered idea number 3. Priestley uses the inspector's speech to advocate the establishment of a socialist society that takes responsibility for its members. That's us finished our first 3 ideas now. In a second we will test you to see how well you have remembered each of these ideas. Let's read through them one more time. Number 1, Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to emphasize the theme of responsibility. Number 2, Priestley uses Eva Smith to represent the poor and vulnerable who suffer because of capitalist society's cruelty. And number 3, Priestley uses the inspector's speech to advocate the establishment of a socialist society that takes responsibility for its members. Now let's test your memory on those ideas. You have 30 seconds to say those ideas to yourself, filling in the key words. Okay, let's see how well we have remembered these 3 ideas. Number 1. Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to emphasize the theme of responsibility. Number 2. Priestley uses Eva Smith to represent the poor and vulnerable who suffer because of capitalist society's cruelty. Number 3. Priestley uses the inspector's speech to advocate the establishment of a socialist society that takes responsibility for its members. Let's go on to idea number 4 now. This brings us to our 4th and final point. Priestley uses the inspector's speech as a warning about society's failure to protect the poor and vulnerable. The inspector finishes his speech with a grim prediction. He says if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. So the inspector is basically suggesting here that society will be punished if it fails to learn its lesson about taking responsibility for its members. What sort of punishment will this be? Well, the inspector says that they will be taught their lesson in fire and blood and anguish. So this description very much uses the imagery of destruction and bloodshed. You could describe such terrifying language as biblical apocalyptic imagery. This sort of biblical imagery is used to describe God's judgment upon the world. The inspector is talking here like an Old Testament prophet and seems to be calling down divine punishment upon British 1912 society. This presentation of the inspector seems to add a great gravitas to his message. He seems to be God's representative on earth. He is delivering a message warning society that it must turn away from its sins or face punishment. Now, Priestley uses dramatic irony here. Dramatic irony is when the audience know something that the characters don't. You see, the Birling family living in 1912 are in complete ignorance about the horrific events that will shake their world in the coming decades. But the audience are aware of these events. When the audience listens to the inspector deliver his prophecy of fire and blood and anguish, they would likely think of 2 different historical events. They may think of the violent Russian Revolution of 1917, especially as the play was first performed in Moscow, or they may think about the horrors of the 2 world wars that many in Priestley's audience would have lived through. Either way, such words are a warning, urging a post-war audience to heed the inspector's message, care for the poor and vulnerable, or face similar bloodshed and destruction. Now, you can imagine that this message would have been particularly prescient for the Priestley's 1945 audience. They were in a society that had been traumatized by the bloodiest 50 years in human history. And now, the inspector is presenting a warning that this vicious cycle of cruelty and death will indeed continue if they do not heed the inspector's message and take care of the poor and vulnerable. And there we go, we have now finished our 4th and final point. Priestley uses the inspector's speech as a warning about society's failure to protect the poor and vulnerable. Now that we have finished all 4 ideas, We will read through them one more time before we test your memory. Point number 1. Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to emphasise the theme of responsibility. Number 2. Priestley uses Eva Smith to represent the poor and vulnerable who suffer because of capitalist society's cruelty. Number 3. Priestley uses the inspector's speech to advocate the establishment of a socialist society that takes responsibility for its members. And point number 4. Priestley uses the inspector's speech as a warning about society's failure to protect the poor and vulnerable. You've now got 40 seconds to read through those sentences, trying to fill in the key words. Okay, let's see how well we have done. Point number 1. Priestley inverts the typical structure of a detective narrative to emphasise the theme of responsibility. Point number 2. Priestley uses Eva Smith to represent the poor and vulnerable who suffer because of capitalist society's cruelty. Point number 3. Priestley uses the inspector's speech to advocate the establishment of a socialist society that takes responsibility for its members. Point number 4. Priestley uses the inspector's speech as a warning about society's failure to protect the poor and vulnerable. Well done if you've got full marks. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you want to see the textbook section on Inspector Goole's final speech, you can download it in the information box below. If you found this video useful, please like and subscribe. My next video will be on the ending of a play. But for now, all the best.